Welcome to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and today we're diving deep into a specific phenomenon that psychology research has recently validated: how losing a pet can reactivate unresolved grief for deceased human loved ones, and equally important, how losing a human loved one can reactivate unresolved grief for a deceased pet. This bidirectional grief reactivation challenges everything we thought we knew about bereavement. Today's exploration draws from comprehensive research analyzing over 50 peer reviewed studies that specifically examine this phenomenon. What emerges is evidence that when we experience one type of loss, it can fully reawaken another type of loss from our past, regardless of how much time has passed or whether the original loss was human or animal. Let's start with what the research actually demonstrates. Multiple studies provide what researchers rate as strong evidence, 8 out of 10 on the reliability scale, that pet loss can and does re-trigger unresolved grief for deceased human loved ones. This isn't about simple reminders or memories. This is about full emotional reactivation, where grief that might have been dormant for decades suddenly becomes acute again. The seminal clinical research on this comes from a study examining women who experienced early maternal loss. These women often formed exceptionally strong bonds with pets, using them as what researchers term transitional objects, psychological bridges that help them manage the unresolved grief from losing their mothers. The research found that when these pets died, sometimes decades after the maternal loss, the women didn't just grieve the pet. They experienced a full reactivation of their maternal grief with the same intensity as if the loss were fresh. Think about what this means psychologically. A woman loses her mother at age 8. The grief is enormous but poorly supported. Perhaps people tell her she needs to be strong, or she doesn't have the emotional vocabulary to process such profound loss. She gets a dog at age 12 who becomes her emotional lifeline. That dog lives for 15 years. When the dog dies when she's 27, the research shows she's not just grieving a pet. She's simultaneously grieving her mother with the full force of that original loss, plus all the accumulated pain of the intervening years. The mechanism behind this involves what researchers call echoing grief. When we experience a significant loss, it creates what we might think of as an emotional imprint in our psychological landscape. This imprint doesn't fade with time if the grief remains unprocessed. Instead, it waits, like an echo in a canyon, ready to be activated by the right trigger. A new loss, even of a different type, can cause all those old echoes to reverberate simultaneously. Research examining nearly 500 adults found that attachment style is the strongest predictor of whether someone will experience this grief reactivation. People with anxious attachment styles, those who form intense bonds and deeply fear abandonment, showed the highest rates of reactivated grief. When these individuals lost a pet, the research documented that they frequently experienced what they described as an avalanche of old griefs, with human losses from years or decades past suddenly feeling immediate and overwhelming. But here's where the research gets particularly compelling. This phenomenon works in both directions. Studies document with equally strong evidence that human loss can re-trigger unresolved grief for deceased pets. The research describes this bidirectionality as fundamental to understanding how our attachment systems actually work. Our brains don't categorize attachment by species. They respond to the breaking of emotional bonds, regardless of whether those bonds were with humans or animals. One particularly revealing study examined individuals who had experienced childhood pet loss that was never properly acknowledged, what researchers term disenfranchised grief. Years or decades later, when these individuals experienced a human loss, they found themselves unexpectedly grieving their childhood pets with fresh intensity. One case study documented a man who, while arranging his father's funeral, found himself sobbing uncontrollably about his childhood dog who had died 30 years earlier. He reported feeling confused and ashamed. Why was he thinking about a dog when his father had just died? The research reveals the answer: disenfranchised grief, grief that isn't socially recognized or validated, doesn't get properly metabolized. It accumulates in our psychological system like undigested emotional material. When we experience a socially recognized loss, like the death of a parent, it can create an opening for all that unprocessed grief to finally surface. The man wasn't choosing to grieve his dog over his father. He was experiencing the simultaneous activation of multiple unresolved losses. Studies from Korea examining childhood trauma add another crucial dimension. Researchers found that individuals with trauma histories were significantly more likely to experience complicated grief after pet loss, with that grief often reactivating trauma related losses. For someone whose childhood was marked by instability, loss, or abuse, a pet might have represented their first and only safe attachment. When that pet dies, it doesn't just trigger current grief, it reactivates all the losses and violations of safety from their traumatic past. The research identifies specific factors that make this grief reactivation more likely. Beyond attachment style and trauma history, the studies point to what they call loss load, the accumulated weight of multiple losses over a lifetime. People with high loss loads don't simply add new griefs to old ones. Instead, each new loss can trigger a cascade effect where multiple previous losses become simultaneously active. Case analyses reveal consistent patterns in how this manifests. The research documents that when someone experiences pet loss that triggers human grief, they often report specific sensations: feeling ambushed by emotion, confusion about what they're actually grieving, shame about the intensity of their reaction, and a sense of emotional time travel where past and present grief become indistinguishable. The temporal aspects documented in the research challenge our assumptions about grief having an expiration date. Multiple studies found cases where pet loss triggered grief for human losses from 40 or even 50 years prior. One study documented a 70-year-old woman whose cat's death triggered intense grief for her brother, who had died when she was 20. She reported that the grief felt exactly the same as it had 50 years ago, as if no time had passed at all. This temporal collapse makes sense when we understand how emotional memory works. The brain regions involved in processing attachment and loss, particularly the anterior cingulate cortex and areas of the prefrontal cortex, don't operate on calendar time. When activated by a current loss, they can bring forward emotional memories from any point in our lives with their full original intensity. The research on continuing bonds theory provides crucial insight into why some people are more vulnerable to this grief reactivation. Studies show that people who maintain what researchers call frozen continuing bonds, desperate, painful attempts to deny the reality of loss, are more likely to experience severe reactivation. These individuals haven't transformed their relationships with the deceased from physical to psychological presence. Instead, they're holding on with white knuckles to something that can't be held. When a new loss occurs, it threatens these frozen bonds and can cause multiple griefs to become simultaneously acute. Now let's examine what the research tells us about the reverse direction, when human loss triggers pet grief. While less extensively studied, the evidence is equally compelling. The research explicitly identifies this as not unidirectional. Grief reactivation can flow in any direction between any significant losses. Studies document cases where the death of a human loved one suddenly brought forward intense grief for pets who had died years earlier. The research suggests this is particularly likely when the pet grief was disenfranchised, never properly acknowledged or processed. A woman grieving her mother might find herself also grieving the cat she had as a child, with both griefs feeling equally present and urgent. One study examining support hotline calls found that people frequently reported confusion about experiencing pet grief while planning human funerals. They felt they were grieving wrong or being disrespectful to the human deceased by thinking about animals. The research reveals they weren't grieving wrong. they were experiencing the natural interconnection of significant losses across their lifetime. The neurobiological research, while not the primary focus of these studies, helps explain the mechanism. When we form attachments, specific neural pathways are created. When an attachment is broken through death, those pathways don't simply disappear, they remain, carrying the emotional charge of the loss. A new loss can reactivate these dormant pathways, bringing the old loss back to full emotional life. Research on what's called grief spirals documents how this reactivation can become self reinforcing. Thinking about the current loss leads to thinking about a past loss, which intensifies the current grief, which triggers more past grief. People describe feeling caught in an escalating cycle where multiple losses feed off each other, creating overwhelming emotional intensity. The studies consistently identify certain populations as particularly vulnerable. Older adults facing bereavement overload, multiple losses in succession, show high rates of grief reactivation. When an elderly person loses their pet, it might trigger grief not just for one previous loss, but for an entire cohort of deceased friends, family members, and previous pets. Children and adolescents represent another vulnerable group, though research here is more limited. Case studies document that children who experience pet loss often show delayed grief reactions that emerge when they later experience human losses. A child who couldn't fully process their dog's death at age 7 might find that grief emerging with full force when a grandparent dies when they're 17. The research on gender differences reveals interesting patterns. While women might be more likely to consciously recognize and articulate the connection between their pet grief and human grief, men often experience the reactivation through somatic symptoms, physical manifestations like sleep disturbance, appetite changes, or unexplained pain. The research suggests this might be because men are often socialized to express emotional vulnerability primarily through relationships with pets, making pet loss a particular trigger for other suppressed griefs. Studies examining cultural factors find that while the phenomenon appears universal, its expression varies significantly. In cultures where pet grief is particularly disenfranchised, the reactivation of human grief by pet loss might be more intense because neither loss can be properly processed. Conversely, in cultures with strong traditions of honoring all forms of loss, the reactivation might be less complicated because each loss has been given space for expression. The research on euthanasia decisions adds unique complexity. Unlike most human deaths in contemporary Western culture, pet deaths often involve actively choosing to end suffering. Studies document that making this choice can trigger intense re examination of human deaths where such choices were or weren't made. Someone who euthanized their dog might find themselves revisiting their parents' prolonged death, wondering if different choices should have been made. Assessment research reveals a critical gap in how we evaluate and treat grief. Most grief assessment tools are designed for single losses and don't capture the complexity of reactivated grief. When someone presents with what appears to be excessive grief over a pet, standard assessments might miss that they're actually grieving multiple losses simultaneously. The research calls for new assessment approaches that can identify and address interconnected losses. Studies on therapeutic interventions show that integrated approaches work best. Rather than treating pet grief and human grief as separate phenomena, effective therapy addresses them as interconnected experiences. The research documents better outcomes when therapists can hold space for multiple griefs simultaneously, allowing clients to move fluidly between processing different losses without imposing artificial boundaries. The research on meaning making reveals that how people interpret their interconnected losses significantly affects outcomes. Some people find meaning in recognizing that their deep grief reflects their deep capacity for love across species boundaries. Others find meaning in understanding their losses as interconnected chapters in their life story. The key finding is that meaning must emerge organically rather than being imposed. Post traumatic growth research offers hope. Some individuals who work through pet loss that triggered human grief report unexpected positive outcomes. They describe finally being able to process losses they'd carried for decades. They report feeling more integrated, as if previously disconnected parts of their grief story finally make sense together. This doesn't minimize the pain, but it does suggest potential for comprehensive healing when multiple griefs are processed together. The research on social support reveals crucial patterns. People who successfully navigate reactivated grief typically have at least one person who understands and validates the complexity of their experience. This might be a therapist, a support group member, or a friend who doesn't minimize any aspect of their grief. The studies emphasize that validation of the interconnected nature of losses is more important than the quantity of support. Dream research documents fascinating patterns. People experiencing reactivated grief often report dreams where deceased pets and humans appear together. These dreams might represent the psyche's attempt to process multiple losses simultaneously to acknowledge the connections between different attachments and their losses. While sometimes distressing, these dreams might be part of the natural integration process. The research on identity and role transitions reveals another layer. When pet loss triggers human grief, people often confront multiple identity losses simultaneously. They're not just losing their identity as a pet owner, they're re experiencing the identity losses from previous bereavements. This can create profound disorientation about who they are without these various attachments. Studies examining physical health impacts show significant effects. The stress of carrying multiple activated griefs can manifest in measurable health changes, immune suppression, cardiovascular strain, cognitive impacts. The research documents that these health effects are often more severe than would be expected from a single loss, reflecting the cumulative burden of multiple griefs. Longitudinal research, though limited, suggests something remarkable. People who successfully process pet loss that triggered human grief often show better long term psychological outcomes than those who grieved losses separately. The interconnected processing seems to allow for addressing patterns and themes across losses rather than repeatedly opening and closing different grief processes. The research on resilience factors identifies key elements that predict successful navigation of reactivated grief. These include previous experiences of successfully processing loss, capacity for emotional regulation, ability to create meaning from difficult experiences, and crucially, freedom from shame about the interconnected nature of their griefs. Studies examining what happens when people get new pets after experiencing reactivated grief show complex patterns. The new attachment might provide an opportunity to work through old losses in a safer way, or it might trigger guilt about replacing previous attachments. The research finds no universal pattern. Outcomes depend on individual factors and the degree to which previous losses have been processed. The implications for clinical practice are profound. The research calls for comprehensive loss histories in assessment, recognition that presenting grief might represent multiple losses, and therapeutic approaches that can address interconnected losses without imposing hierarchies of legitimacy. For society more broadly, the research challenges us to reconsider how we understand and support grief. The artificial boundaries we create between legitimate and lesser losses don't reflect psychological reality. When we minimize any loss, we potentially complicate not just that grief, but all connected griefs. As we consider the full scope of this research, several crucial findings stand out. The bidirectional reactivation between pet and human grief is not a sign of pathology, but a normal response reflecting the interconnected nature of our attachments. The intensity of reactivated grief doesn't indicate weakness, but rather the depth of our capacity for love across all boundaries. The confusion and shame people feel about these experiences often cause more suffering than the grief itself. For those experiencing this phenomenon, the research offers profound validation. Your experience of having pet loss trigger human grief or human loss trigger pet grief is real, documented, and shared by many others. The intensity that seems disproportionate to the current loss makes perfect sense when understood as multiple losses becoming simultaneously active. The confusion about what you're actually grieving is a normal response to the activation of interconnected losses. The path through reactivated grief isn't linear or predictable. The research shows that people move between different griefs, sometimes unable to distinguish between them, sometimes crystal clear about each loss. This isn't confusion, it's how our psyche naturally processes interconnected losses. If you're supporting someone through loss, remember that what presents as one grief might be many. Hold space for the full complexity of their experience. Don't try to separate or hierarchize their losses. Understand that they might be grieving their entire loss history, not just the apparent current loss. The research ultimately reveals that our capacity for attachment and our response to loss don't follow the neat categories we've constructed. Love crosses species boundaries, and so does grief. When we honor this truth, we create possibilities for more complete healing. Your grief, all of it, for every being you've loved and lost, is valid. The connections between your losses are real. Your experience of having one loss trigger another is documented, studied, and understood. You're not alone in this complex landscape of interconnected loss and love. Thank you for joining me on Strides to Solutions. Every loss, every love, and every connection between them deserves recognition and honor.